This is structured into 5 parts. A bit about how the energy market is structured and how it's changing, to give you a bit of context as to how the app's structured and the team's structured. And then as well going into how we do app feature development, how we're planning to improve that in 2020, and a bit about React Native itself in 2020. So starting with the retail market, energy starts at production and flows through transmission via the national grid, then into local distributors, and then finally customers interact with retail companies such as OVO. It's a pretty big market. On average, every home spending £4,650 on energy a year, resulting in a pretty big market of total revenue, 125 billion. Energy used to be pretty boring, at least in my opinion. 6 big companies like British Gas holding 100% market share until 2004. That's recently been changing. OVO, with its partnership / purchase of SSE, Scottish Southern Power, is now number 2. And then you can see at the bottom there, companies that are quite renewable focused, such as Bulb. Why might this be happening? Well, we're seeing everyday people are becoming climate activists, and we're seeing a lot of sort of like strange climate change happening this year, and no doubt going forward. But I think, at least what I've seen at OVO is people here are pretty optimistic. In the book, More from Less, there's 4 sort of tenets of optimism: capitalism, responsive government regulation, public awareness, and tech progress. And there's a few reasons to be optimistic. Renewable energy, electricity usage overtook fossil fuels in the UK for the first time in 2019. Not so relevant in January, but solar module costs have dropped by around 99% in 40 years. And sort of speaking of that sort of like progressive government regulation, in the UK, every energy retail company has to offer customers smart meters. And what do smart meters offer? They offer the ability for you to easily switch your retail energy provider. They give you estimated billing, which results in easier budgeting. And they give you more real-time data, which gives you more knowledge about your energy usage. What does that result in? Well, energy retail companies basically turn into real-time analytics technology companies. So you have sort of the incumbents struggling to provide good customer experiences in the app market. What's OVO's sort of mission, therefore? It's to make it easy for anyone to get to carbon zero. And the approach really is take smart hardware like the smart meter, which generates data such as usage, which makes it easy for you to understand your usage as an insight, and then OVO can provide you actions on how you can increase that. And then sort of taking those insights and putting them in a nice, easy-to-use app, which leads on nicely to the OVO app itself. So the OVO app was released in 2017 purely as just sort of web views. Before that, there was a native app, but there was a sort of re-architecture in 2017 with a sort of React Native shell pushing forward with web views. Started as JavaScript, then adopted Flow, and now currently TypeScript, still fully sort of like Redux using observables and selectors. And quite interestingly, most contributors to the app are web engineers. So if most people have just some React.js experience, and then they're very, very quickly contributing to the app via a sort of like feature development process. How's the app sort of structured? Well, we've got the sort of like login, which then reroutes you to either the Apollo or the Orion app. Remember that smart meter thing? If you don't have one, you're going to be in the Apollo app, which is sort of like older, where you have to put in your meter readings manually. But then if you are a customer with a smart meter, you're then routed to the Orion app, where all of that's sort of automatic and your payments are taken automatically. How do we do that in practice? So we basically have 3 separate Redux stores and 3 separate instances of React navigation. And another thing that we're very sort of like across both the Apollo and Orion app, we're very open to feedback, which actually results in quite a lot of interesting feedback from the older generations, which is very nice to see. And it's also a reminder for us to continue to make the app very accessible with a nice font size, color contrast, and usable by the screen reader, all of which React Native provides. And hopefully we can keep improving. You can see a big increase in the sort of 5-star reviews around the time we dropped the web views and adopted React Native fully, with the dark red being 1-star reviews, and the stacks for monthly reviews being in dark green. So regarding app feature development, it's structured into 7 steps. So firstly, get the teams talking. So remember how earlier I said it's split into a technical domain? Teams at OVO are either industry-facing or they're customer-facing. And those teams are communicating via Kafka streams. That results in the app, us consuming APIs from those teams sort of separately, but via one sort of API gateway. So at the bottom, you've got Kafka topics generated by industry teams that turn into a sort of like APIs structured by customer-facing teams. We don't want features contributed to result in very, very large PRs. So we set up sort of feature flags using Firebase remote config, and then feature developers or our app contributors will hide those features behind feature flags using our feature flag component. We then start creating a mock for those sort of like API requests and responses, or the API responses themselves. Inside the app, on the staging app and the local app, we have a sort of secret place hidden away that you can tap on called environments, and then you can select the local Orion or local Apollo or UAT or production environment if you want. That means that you can set up a mock file, a sort of JSON response of what the 200 response looks like via HTTP, as well as you also being to provide, if you select mass failure, see the UI and what happens when you have a 500 or 400 error response. How do we actually go about doing that? We inject a sort of mock fetch client into our Redux observable middleware, and we then set up sort of mock JSON files that have a URL which has a regex which will pick up that URL and response. And that results in very clean sort of state management in Redux Observable. They're called epics, which enable you to get data from that mocked HTTP client. So now it's time to actually develop that feature. So you've done your data fetching using a mock, so now you're adding your actions, reducer, selectors, and then developing that UI using sort of our component library and storybooks. Now it's time to test. So very sort of like native JavaScript, TypeScript-y sort of testing stack, making full use of sort of React Native specific components where necessary, in particular the React Native testing library and Detox. Detox is our sort of like end-to-end testing framework. We heavily rely on Detox tests because we don't have QA engineers at OVO, so teams are very much reliant on making sure that their features work. What does a Detox test look like? Well, here you go. And then now it's time to measure that feature using Mixpanel, so generally communicating with PMs, product managers, on what sort of the engagement should look like in terms of measuring for that feature. And then it's time to sort of like release that feature. So we have a Mac Mini hired out via Mac Stadium, which is connected to our GitHub repository, all via GitHub Actions, which is then running those detox tests on every pull request. And then if all goes well, we're deploying to either natively the App Store, Play Store, or Code Push. What is Code Push? Code Push is provided by Microsoft that enables you to update your app over the air, so you don't have to go via the public review process. What that results in, it means that we can, similar to a website, deploy the app almost at any time very, very quickly. So how we're looking to improve the feature development in 2020? So I've stolen this from the CEO of Zeit.co. He did a sort of 2019 in review. But I feel it's really, really apt for how we're going to consider feature development in the future. Basically, everything's going to flow through Git. And you're going to have, in terms of React Native, you're going to have your detox tests, product feedback, manual QA, performance testing, Android, iOS cross-mobile testing, and then internal testing, all with a sort of like deployed app that you can actually access via the browser using a tool called Appetize. And there's a few more things that we need to achieve in 2020 to get that completely all ticked off. So we need to add screenshot diffs, visual testing. In theory, it's very possible. If we have all the storybook components and we have Detox, we can get Detox to run through the storybook and then take screenshots on every time we change the app. We can add API sort of tests using Pact, and we can properly deploy the app using Appetize. So Appetize, there's the app in the browser which you can interact with via your mouse. So a few things that are coming up in 2020 for React Native. The first is something called universal apps. So you might remember that or consider React Native to just be about iOS and Android. I think this year we're going to see a lot more of React Native being compatible with web and Windows. The reason for this is a tool called Expo, which bundles React Native for web. So using your React Native components, they'll transpile sort of to the DOM. And Microsoft is heavily adopting React Native as a development tool to create Windows apps. And then finally, maybe Mac OS too. So last year, Apple at WWDC announced Project Catalyst, which enables you to take your iPad apps and implement them as native Mac apps. So if you have a React Native iPad app, then you should be able to turn it into a Mac app too. Finally, there's the re-architecture, which Facebook is announced in 2018. It's taken quite a while, but essentially, it's getting rid of the bridge and adopting a new sort of structure that should promise a lot more performance. And there's not enough time to talk about that now, but if you do want to look more about that, find out more, there's both blog posts on formidable.com/blog, and there's a talk on YouTube by Lorenzo, who's a React Native core committer. Thanks. Any questions?
Amazing talk, thank you. Just a question about your CI. How long does it take to run CI including all the docs tests on every PR?
So our detox tests take 15 minutes.
15
minutes to run through the entire ones. To give you a bit more context there, that's including both the success and failure responses. One tip I give you is use that sort of dedicated infrastructure. Either get a Mac Mini in your office or hire it out dedicated, so you're not using like a sort of virtualized environment. That's pretty important, we found.
Do you run them on both iOS and Android?
2020, we're looking to adopt Android. We found detox a bit flaky on Android, but we're hoping to figure that out.
Yeah, I noticed you mentioned you moved from Flow to TypeScript, which is something that we're sort of dreaming of doing at some point. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on like how that went and how hard that was for you.
I wasn't there for that, so. But looking at the commit log, it doesn't seem like it was too difficult because they were with TypeScript you can incrementally adopt it. So it takes in JavaScript files, and Metro takes in TypeScript files. So I think it's probably relatively painless. You probably just got to get together as a team and decide how you want to go about that. Do we have a web app and do we share logic? So I think many of you probably realize, hey, the Redux code's probably going to be the same as the web app and the app, like in most cases. I've seen a few examples of this working out in open source. There's a company called Mattermark, which is basically like a B2B SaaS open source Slack, and they have a repository where they share both their Redux code for their web and mobile. I'd love for us to adopt something like this. Sadly, I think just by nature of geography, the web team's in Bristol and we're in London, and I think that barrier has just sort of meant that the sort of engineering process hasn't quite gelled into a sort of like shared repository for components. But I think we're definitely in the sort of planning stage for that. Yeah.
So just dock each other to keep stuff in sync.
Yeah, I think you can do surprisingly well just by PR comments. Like, yeah, again.
Another question on testing. Have you considered using a device farm to test on real devices?
Yeah, so I think the announcement, so context, device farm is AWS, Amazon Web Services device farm thing, right?
Not necessarily, there are different providers.
Sure, but there are, different providers, but I think, for example, AWS provide a device farm where you can, in theory, test any range of Android and iOS mobile devices and maybe apply your tests to all those devices, and then you'll build per minute for those tests running. I haven't seen someone do this with Detox yet. I'm not sure if you know anyone.
No, that's my question because you cannot, so you have to use Appio. Yeah. But it's more like about the question is, do you find it useful to test on real physical devices, especially when it comes to such a variety, when it comes to Android?
I think almost certainly it'd be ideal if we could test on physical devices. So just a sort of war story. We upgraded Firebase in, when was it? I think around August, September. And that version of iOS Firebase didn't work on 32-bit iOS devices. It crashed. So had we actually tested properly on an iOS iPhone 5, we would have picked that up. But our detox tests are running on an iPhone 8, and we just didn't quite pick that up in manual QA. Cool, I think that's everyone.
much.